Hi, I'm Natalie Emmanuel. Today we'll look at a controversial 70-year-old chain-smoking grandma who led her country to victory after a surprise attack. Oh. I'm like, wait, we're talking about my grandma? No.
Oh.
No, joking. Okay. Today we'll look at a controversial 70-year-old chain-smoking grandma who led her country to victory after a surprise attack by two ancient adversaries. She sent modern armies with fighter jets and artillery into combat, but she didn't know how many soldiers would make up a division or what tactics to use against Soviet-built tanks. This blunt, hard-working woman had a razor-sharp mind, and in international politics, she could play three-dimensional chess at a grandmaster level. Emily, tell us who we are talking about today.
Natalie, that would be Golda Meir, one of the 20th century's most extraordinary women. Her family fled persecution in the Russian Empire, but she was welcomed by thousands in Moscow 50 years later. She negotiated peace deals at the United Nations and was a close ally of the United States in the Cold War.
Golda had a remarkable character arc, didn't she? But what I'm impressed with is how fearless she was.
And it's not like she was never afraid.
Right. As we know, true courage doesn't mean you are never afraid. On film, I've played lots of courageous women who were scared out of their wits but did what they had to do. Courage is sometimes being afraid but still doing your duty, wherever that duty might lead you.
That's so true. Emily, I remembered when I found out that as a young nurse, this was, I guess, a couple of years ago, you would run to the sound of gunfire to give first aid to somebody who had been shot 4 times near your apartment.
Wow.
A basic instinct is to stay clear of the shooting, but I remember, Emily, you grabbed a first aid kit and kept the victim alive until the paramedics got there. So I guess courage comes in a lot of forms, and it certainly doesn't mean you're never scared.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the scarier moments I've had. I was just sitting outside drying my hair, and when I heard that, and we were talking a little bit before our show today about how courage isn't not being afraid, but it's being afraid and doing it anyway. So back to our war queens. In another episode, we looked at Indira Gandhi, a woman who, like you, Natalie, practiced yoga, maintained a good diet, and took good care of her health. Golda didn't do that, though, did she?
Oh, no. She went in the opposite direction. She smoked packs of cigarettes every day. She drank pot after pot of coffee, and she never got enough sleep. That's pretty much the opposite of everything I do, although I do drink coffee quite a bit.
And you don't get much sleep.
It's got coffee has a chokehold over me right now, and I'm trying to wean myself.
Oh, goodness. So, Dad, I know Golda is one of your favorite women in our book, and you are the lead author in her chapter, so why don't you start us off with her story?
Golda Meir, that's how she started out in life, born in Ukraine in 1898. Her parents moved to Milwaukee at the turn of the century because there was a lot of repression of Jewish families in the Russian Empire at the time, and her family was obviously Jewish. She grew up with some causes that she embraced at an early age. A lot of it was because she had an older sister who influenced her. Zionism, socialism, women's suffrage, those were causes that she grew up with. After World War I, Golda moved with her husband to Palestine, and she began working her way up the political ladder of the sort of Jewish political group. At the time, Palestine was being administered by the British under a mandate after the First World War. Now, Israel at the time, or rather the Jewish leadership, wasn't very welcoming to women as senior leaders. There were conservative newspapers, Jewish newspapers, who later would give her kudos for her work ethic and being a very smart woman, smart administrator, but they didn't really like the idea of a woman running things.
Yeah, sometimes they would really just have no choice. Like in this case, when the British arrested all of the Jewish leadership or the male Jewish leadership, she really had to step up to be a part of the political movement in the government.
She was free. The British didn't arrest her during this big sweep they did in the late 1940s. And the joke started going around that with Golda outside, the best man in government was free.
Yeah, of course it can't be a woman, it has to be a man.
Right. Now, we've heard that one before, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. Margaret Thatcher as well.
Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, that goes all the way back to Artemisia and the time of Herodotus, that best man in government shtick. And I remember Golda said frequently that she didn't like that joke, because she said it implies that it's better to be born a man than a woman. And she said, I fundamentally disagree with that.
Yeah, it's kind of a sexist thing to take away, like, you can't have accomplishments unless you're compared to the men. And she really wasn't like the nurturing type. Like, she's not there to coddle and hold your hand through everything. She was more like maybe M from James Bond, where you got to get the work done, and she'll back you up.
Yeah, I mean, she could be really cold-blooded.
Yeah, she had zero patience. She was like, you need to be working long hours. You need to be producing results. I had a basketball coach like that, if you remember. You put in the work, you put in the time, and that's where you can finally feel accomplished.
Exactly. Well, she could also be extremely ruthless whenever she needed to be. Back when the British were running Palestine at this time, there were a couple of Jewish militant gangs that were, these were groups that were basically terrorists. They were doing bombings, they were doing assassinations of British officials, and they were bringing the wrath of the British Empire down on the Jews who were trying to start a political movement there. And Golda advocated stopping those people. These are guys like Menachem Begin, who later became the Israeli prime minister. She said they had to be stopped by any means necessary.
And that means what we all think it means, right? All means necessary.
Yeah, she actually advocated assassinating Jewish terrorists like Menachem Begin, men of this group called the Stern Gang, to make them stop bringing down British reprisals on the mainstream Jewish leadership. To Golda, the goal was to create a state of Israel, and she was not going to let anything get in the way of that, and she could be very, very cold-blooded when she had to be.
Definitely. And so by 1948, Israel finally has its independence. It is that state of Israel that she's always wanted. But of course, it gets eyed by all of its neighbors, 6 different countries. We had Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, I keep saying Syria, Iran, and Lebanon as well.
Yeah. Basically, right after the British pulled out and Israel declared independence, these 6 countries all dogpile on Israel. It was a war of independence, and during that time, Golda was not leading troops. She never would actually lead combat troops. But her job was to stay back in Jerusalem. She helped with managing the defense of Jerusalem. She organized food and ammunition and supplies, and basically made sure that the military got what it needed to survive the storm, that the phones and the water lines were still working. Basically, she administered the capital and some of the infrastructure during Israel's War of Independence.
And that's incredibly important. I mean, we talk about these war queens plenty, but we also have to see their ability to logistically handle their countries during this time, and she would prove to be very effective. So anyway, Israel gets its independence.
Yeah, wins independence.
But then it gets into a war with Egypt over the control of the Suez Canal in 1956.
Yeah. So this is like 8 years later. We fast forward. Gamal Nasser is the president of Egypt. He closes the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping, and that is a threat to Israel's economy. So they get into a war. This is the United States is kind of the honest broker in the middle. You've got Egypt on one side, and then you've got Britain, France, and Israel on the other side. Well, the Israelis go in, they move up against the Suez Canal through the Sinai, and in the end, Israel, Britain, and France all had to back down to the United States pressure. This was under Dwight Eisenhower. He basically told the Israelis, you need to back down, and he told Britain, I'm gonna stomp on you economically if you don't back off. And so I think Golda learned from the Suez Crisis of 1956 that sometimes Israel had to limit its military objectives because it needed friends like the United States. And one of the hallmarks of Golda's military leadership is that she would never let military tactical objectives compromise the big political decisions. So 10 years later, Golda leaves politics. This is 1966. She's 68 years old, and she's got a lot of health problems now. She's got migraines and shingles and gallbladder problems and lymphoma. And her doctors, as you can imagine, told her she needed to quit smoking. She refused. She said, look, I'm 68. If I quit smoking, I'm still not going to die young.
Yeah, well, she kind of had her priorities set.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I mean, this was her, this was who she was.
Yeah, and part of who she was politics. So even though she left, she would continue on with politics throughout her life. So in the next year, Israeli intelligence tells them that Egypt, Syria, and Jordan are about to attack Israel once again. Even though she's not in the cabinet at the time, the prime minister actually invites her to sit in on these meetings to decide, does Israel need to hit first? Do we need to wait? Because he really valued her input and her opinion.
The question is, do you strike the first blow?
And her philosophy would be that, yeah, we need to hit first. And to quote her, she said, if we have a choice between being dead and pitied and being alive with a bad image, we'd rather be alive with a bad image.
Yeah.
Which I agree.
Yeah, I mean, this was she knew that a lot of things she would do would be unpopular. She knew that from the 1956 crisis. But she still was not going to let anything stop her defense of Israel. That was her guiding principle. So by this time, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launches a surprise first strike, destroying the Egyptian Air Force. Then it turns around, refuels, rearms, and it goes over and destroys the Syrian and Jordanian air forces that were covering the troops that were about to invade her. So this became a total kick-ass win. The Israelis wiped out the invaders in 6 days, and as a result of this war, they called it the 6-Day War, the Israelis got control of the Sinai Peninsula in the south near Egypt, they got control of the Golan Heights in the north near Syria, and they got the west bank of the Jordan River near Jordan.
This is an iconic victory for her. This is a big.
Yeah, this is a total mic drop. And 2 years later, there's another mic drop, but of a different kind. Israel's prime minister dies of a heart attack. So the party leaders ask Golda to become the new Israeli prime minister. So now she's 70 years old. She's kind of plump. She's got a lot of health problems. She shuffles around. She asks her doctor, Doc, tell me, give it to me straight, like in the movies, how much time have I got? And the doctor said she could reasonably expect about 10 years. And she went back and thought about it and thought, all right, 10 years, that's enough time for me to be prime minister and to kind of finish my part in Israel's story.
Definitely, and Israel's story was changing so much at this time. I mean, you think about, she's 70 years old taking on one of the most complicated jobs in the entire world, with all of the relationships in the Middle East, relationships between world superpowers were changing, and this 70-year-old woman is like, okay, sure, I'll do it.
Yeah, and the demographics of Israel were changing as well, and there were a lot of social problems and just social changes that were going on also. Now, Emily, this is probably a pretty good time to talk about how, we've got these modern, quote-unquote, war queens, really prime ministers at this point. And we talk about in our podcast their military leadership and their leadership of a country at war, making the big decisions, more political than actual tactical. But and so in our podcast, we are working through their military records. But of course, as civilian leaders, they also had social policies and social records. And those were not without controversy for virtually all of them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, for instance, Indira Gandhi, there were domestically, outside of her purely military leadership role, there were Sikhs who felt that they were an oppressed minority under her regime. Her regime had some corruption issues as well. Margaret Thatcher, another good example.
Yeah, definitely a polarizing one.
Yeah, with her social issues.
Yeah, and Natalie has a very unique point of view where she could tell us from her experiences with her family. We talked about all of the horrible things Margaret Thatcher did against the civil rights movement in England.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of her policies or economic policies had a disproportionate effect on communities of color. And so Natalie does have, like you say, some insights into that. Golda is the same way. Obviously, ethnic Arabs living in Israel felt that they were second-class citizens during her time in power. Even Jewish citizens who were not Eastern European or Ashkenazi Jews, they felt in some ways discriminated against.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the war records of these people, and Golda is a good example of someone who had a really impressive record as a political military leader. It's not to say that there weren't other aspects of each of these women that were controversial or that we would think of that that way today.
Honestly, genuinely terrible. I mean, we're here to talk about women's rights. We're here to talk about women's wrongs, too.
Yeah.
You know, we look at these track records, and as we're comparing to men, we have to also see a lot of our war queens did some terrible things, some polarizing things. But, you know, we're just here to report on how they did in war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's important to recognize.
Right. So that being said, one thing that never really changed about Golda was her attitude toward security. Henry Kissinger, he was the Secretary of State in the 1970s, once said that Golda saw herself as the mother to her people. And she felt that every square inch of Israel had been nourished by the blood of her children. And in an interview with a reporter from Vogue magazine, Golda said, "We don't thrive on military acts. We do them because we have to, and thank God we're efficient at it."
Through hard work and dedication to her new country, Golda Meir became one of the world's experts in international diplomacy. But tensions between Egypt, Syria, and Israel put her skills as a world leader to the test. Everyone was caught between factions, some that wanted war and others who sought peace. We'll see how Golda balanced that situation when we return after the break.
All right, so 1970s is opening up. What is going on between Egypt, Syria, and Israel, Dad?
All right. It's a somewhat complicated story, but to simplify, basically Egypt and Syria wanted what Israel had captured during the Six-Day War. So Egypt wanted the Sinai back, Syria wanted the Golan Heights back. Israel, for its part, wanted recognition of its borders and wanted a recognition of its right to exist by Egypt and Syria.
That'd be nice.
Yeah. So Egypt wants the Sinai, Syria wants the Golan Heights, but the problem was those two countries told Israel, give us the land back and then we'll negotiate over our recognition of you. And Golda naturally didn't trust them.
No, I wouldn't either.
Right. So between the Six-Day War and 1973, you've got this kind of simmering guerrilla war with militant groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other militias that started hitting back at Israel over the losses in the Six-Day War. And they would shoot rockets or mortars at Israeli settlements on the West Bank or the Golan Heights. And every time an Israeli citizen was killed by a Fedayeen missile or mortar strike, Golda had ordered her staff to call her anytime, day or night, and let her know.
That has to weigh on you so much. Like to ask to be called every time, I think shows a really personable approach to what she was doing. And I think it kind of proves to us that she was intentional, she was involved, and she cared.
Yeah, and she was willing to sort of take the stress that comes with it. So she began having this recurring nightmare that she told a friend about. The nightmare was that she's in a room filled with telephones, and they all start ringing, and she knows what those telephones are going to tell her. And she said, I wake up in a cold sweat, but I can't get back to sleep because I know that the dream's going to come back, and I'm going to hear more telephones telling me more people have been killed.
Yeah, and it's so hard to hit back at these terrorist groups. I mean, we look at it today, it's incredibly difficult because you can't always know what your enemy looks like, know where to hit. And terrorist groups are known for striking and then just disappearing. But after the Munich Olympic killings in 1972, Golda went actually full-on Assassin's Creed to kind of get back at these terrorist groups.
Yeah, so during the Summer Olympics in that year in Munich, Palestinian terrorists of the Black September group held 11 Israeli athletes hostage, and they killed them. And the massacre shocked the world. 3 of the terrorists were able to get away. So Golda called a meeting of her senior advisors, including the Mossad, the Israeli version of our CIA, and she approved a plan called Wrath of God, which was to hunt down and assassinate the PLO and Black September members who were involved with the killings of the Israeli athletes. I think Steven Spielberg made a movie about that some years later.
Yeah, and that definitely, I like seeing the contrast between how personable and caring she was, like taking all of these phone calls, but also how absolutely cold-blooded she was. Like we can't overlook that enough. But we see that with a lot of our other war queens. We see that with Xinga, Katerina, Elizabeth, and especially Cleopatra for sure. They knew that sometimes death and war was part of the national interest, and they weren't here to shy away from that. Men had to die, and war was a part of the solution to the problem. Then men had to die, frankly.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing to have to accept. But when you step into that role, you know that some of your decisions are going to cost lives. In the early 1970s, the Arab world was now divided between hardliners like Syria's president Hafez al-Assad and PLO leader Yasser Arafat, who at least publicly wanted to eliminate Israel. And then you had moderates like Jordan's King Hussein and Egypt's President Anwar Sadat. And these moderates privately accepted the idea that we're going to have to learn to live with Israel. But they knew if they were too open about agreeing to Israel's right to exist, they would become targets for assassination for the hardliners in their country. And you get too friendly with Israel, and you might find a smoking grenade thrown into your lap.
Yeah, the optics are kind of everything with politics.
It was. So Egypt was constantly threatening death to Israel through its information ministry if it didn't give back the Sinai Peninsula. And Golda wasn't going to give back an inch of territory until Egypt first recognized Israel's right to exist.
So Sadat is looking to break this deadlock by invading Israel with Syria. Those countries had done the whole death to Israel thing for so long that Israel must have been pretty much ready.
Well, they were and they weren't. By 1973, this is in the fall, Golda began seeing signs on the ground of a possible Egyptian invasion of the Sinai. But her generals and intelligence chiefs were telling her there probably would not be an invasion that year.
The bulk of Israel's army was actually in its reserve forces. Here in America, we have the National Guard, but that is a volunteer basis. Men and women will volunteer, go train, go back to their jobs. And it was similar to that, but every citizen had a duty to serve. So they would be trained, but most of the country would be doing their day-to-day jobs in between. Golda's generals really needed to know when they were going to get invaded. It was a pretty consistent threat, so they had to be ready. It would take a couple of days to call up the reserves and prepare to go to battle. So they needed to make sure everyone could get to their assembly places, issue their weapons, and begin war.
Exactly. So they had a defense force that was sort of a thin green line that was expected to hold the line until the reserves could get called up. So late 1973, they began getting more warnings of an invasion by Syria and Egypt. Jordan's King Hussein secretly met with Golda at a safe house run by Mossad, and Hussein told her that Egypt and Syria were going to launch an attack jointly. And then the day before Yom Kippur, the highest Jewish holiday, they learned from a secret source in Egypt, it was the son-in-law of the former president, that an attack would happen the next day when a lot of Jews would be at temples and Israel was theoretically the least prepared for a war.
And what was Golda thinking when she found out?
Well, she got her military advisors around her and she asked for their recommendation. And they told her, let's go back to the Six-Day War playbook. We're going to launch a preemptive airstrike. We're going to hit the Egyptians in the morning, turn around and refuel, hit the Syrians in the afternoon. And that would give the Israeli Air Force the ability to stop the Egyptian and Syrian tanks on the ground while they got these reserve troops mobilized and gave them their weapons and got them in place.
That was a really logical choice.
Yeah, that's the military decision. But Golda had to look at things from a political and diplomatic perspective as well. She had a great relationship with the United States. Now, she had grown up in Milwaukee. She had also spent some of her time in Denver. And she was on great terms with President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Well, Kissinger had told her after the Six-Day War that the preemptive airstrike that she had launched had let the Soviet Union and the Arab world claim that she started the war. And Kissinger stressed to Golda time and time again that if there's another war, she can't be the one to fire the first shot. It's kind of like Lincoln with the Civil War at Fort Sumter. Mm-hmm. He didn't want to be in the position of drawing first blood. So they had to make sure before they did anything else that the whole world knew who started the war.
That kind of leaves Golda's hands tied too, because Israel, as you know, if you look at a map, is a small country.
Very small.
You can't let Syria get too far or there goes the whole country.
Yeah. So Golda had a risk, and she took this calculated risk. She reasoned that she would need the United States' help during the war. There would be a lot of tanks lost, a lot of jets, and they would need replacement missiles and ammunition, and they needed the United States to step up and replace those losses. And if she fired the first shot, she was afraid the United States, even under a friend like Richard Nixon, would run for cover and they might run out of ammunition, a week or 2 weeks into the war. Mm-hmm. So Golda overruled her generals and she told them they would not conduct a preemptive first strike. But she did call the United States ambassador and she said, Egypt and Syria look like they're about to invade. Can you guys talk them out of doing something crazy?
And that, unfortunately, didn't end up working out. The Syrians launched an airstrike on October 6th, which would have been the evening of Yom Kippur, and they hit the Israelis really hard. The Egyptians took back part of the Sinai Peninsula, and the Syrians pushed back the Israelis to the Golan Heights. And Golda thought she might have made maybe the wrong decision.
It was something that would always torment her. Her advisors were stunned. The Syrian and Egyptian armed forces were a lot more successful in this war than they had been in any previous war. And Golda's defense minister even talked briefly about the possible destruction of the state of Israel. But Golda hung in there. She liked to say that Jews don't have the luxury of pessimism. Their backs are to the sea, they've got no place to go if they lose. So they better tell themselves they're going to win.
And they had something in their back pocket. They had nuclear weapons, and she could have used those. Her defense minister even suggested, hey, maybe you should go ahead and assemble those so they can use them just in case against the invaders.
Yeah, but Golda shut that idea down in a heartbeat.
Probably wise.
Yeah, well, she was a world-class statesman, and she knew that if Israel broke the taboo against using atomic weapons, then every country in the world would line up against Israel, including the United States.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool to think about. You look at the history of nuclear weapons, like this is a time where a woman could have used those. Like not a lot of people knew that.
Yeah. So she told her defense minister and the head of her Atomic Energy Commission that under no circumstances would Israel use atomic weapons. We're going to stand or fall on our conventional defenses, even though this was a time when there was a lot of uncertainty.
And it would go on to cost a lot of Israelis their lives, unfortunately, but I have to commend her. You know, anytime nuclear weapons are involved, it is a world-changing event.
Yeah. So she's now overruling veteran generals in the decision not to use atomic weapons and the decision not to launch a preemptive strike.
Did it help in the long run, though?
I think it did, because Nixon and Kissinger considered Israel to be a U.S. ally. And they knew that Syria and Egypt were being supplied by America's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. So this is in the middle of the Cold War. Nixon and Kissinger weren't going to let America's friend get beaten by Soviet's allies. But Henry Kissinger was playing a very tricky game here. Kissinger wanted Israel to win so that the Arab nations wouldn't try to invade Israel in the future. But he also wanted Israel to get a little bit beaten up because Golda had been so inflexible in dealing with Egypt and the more moderate Arab leaders that he wanted her to be a little bit more flexible the next time they got to the peace table. So Kissinger waited a little bit before opening up the weapons pipeline. But after about 10 days, the U.S. started shipping in tanks and jets and missiles and all kinds of stuff to Israel, which allowed the Golda's generals and their military leaders to start hitting the Egyptians and the Syrians really hard. Now, footnote to this, the United States was flying in all this equipment in transport planes. And these would be C-5As and 141s. And your grandfather was flying 141s at the time.
Yeah.
So I never got to find out if he was part of this operation, this airlift called Operation Nickelgrass. But anyway, the U.S. Air Force was a big part of this resupply.
Definitely.
So, and you know, Nixon and Kissinger might not have made this big effort to resupply Israel if Israel had launched a preemptive strike before the war began, because then it would look like the U.S. was ganging up with Israel to attack its neighbors rather than defend itself.
Natalie, why don't you take us to the break?
Through the Herculean efforts, Golda managed to turn things around on the battlefront, but there was still a war to be won and peace to be negotiated. After our break, we'll see how Golda went from war leader to peacemaker.
When the war finally began to tilt in Israel's favor, I remember her generals came to her with another really, really difficult decision. They could either send the bulk of their army against Syria's forces at the capital of Damascus, or they could stop where they were and move the army across the Sinai Desert, trying to recapture the Suez Canal. At the time, Golda was 75 now. She was a grandmother, and she had never served in the army. So she was making these big army military decisions, not even knowing some of the basics, like how many men make up a division.
Yeah, one time a reporter asked her when she was watching some military exercise for a comment, and she said, "What do you think I would have to say about that? I don't know anything about military stuff." But the military experts were coming to Golda for advice because she had the big picture. Golda calculated that by the time they could move their tanks and their troops from the Syrian front down to the Egyptian front, basically all the way across the Sinai, the United Nations would be debating a ceasefire resolution, and the UN would would put pressure on the two sides to stop fighting, and the superpowers would probably agree the war had to end. Now, Israel would have to stop fighting or it would face serious consequences. So Golda thought, let's push our advantage against the Syrians while we've got it now, and we'll teach them a lesson they won't forget for a long time. So she was making kind of a tactical decision here. And most of the time when we look at these political national leaders, they don't get involved in tactical decisions. But this is one of those exceptions that the politicians like Golda, like Margaret Thatcher, like Indira, like Cleopatra, they managed the political objectives of the war, and the generals managed the strategy.
Yeah, and this wouldn't be her first rodeo either.
No, she had been through 3 wars. She'd seen a lot of violence up close. Once a man on a bus had been shot and during the fighting in 1948, and he died in her arms.
Oh.
So Golda was uniquely qualified to make these kinds of military decisions, even though she had not been trained in war.
So they stopped the Syrians. They managed to surround the entire Egyptian army. Honestly, they may have been able to invade Egypt. Cairo was right there. They could have probably captured it if they had tried.
Yeah, but the superpowers had a say in the war's outcome. The Soviet Union was seeing its clients, Egypt and Syria, getting their butts kicked, and those countries were ready to agree to anything that would avoid Israel getting to take more land from the Arab countries. Now, the United States was happy that Israel was winning. Now, Henry Kissinger was a non-practicing Jew. He was personal friends with a lot of Israelis, but he thought that if we can get the Israelis to call off an invasion, that full-on invasion of Egypt that takes Cairo, then we'll have a friend for life in Egypt's President Anwar Sadat, and that would keep Golda from becoming overconfident in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So as Kissinger saw it, if both sides ended up bloodied but not broken, they might be able to negotiate a permanent peace treaty someday. So just as the Israeli army is about to destroy the Egyptian Third Army, which is the pride of Egypt's military at the time, Kissinger met with Golda and he told her she had to stop the war. She could not destroy or capture or take prisoner the Third Army. She could not humiliate the Egyptians.
Kissinger definitely kind of had the long game with a lot of different interests on his mind,
Mm-hmm.
but the Israelis must have been outraged.
Yeah, they were. They were about to win this war, and now they're seeing diplomatic defeat snatched from the jaws of victory, or a draw, really, not a defeat. But Golda understood where Kissinger was coming from. She knew the value of having the United States as a loyal ally. So she went back to the cabinet and she made the decision and said, we need to end the war on the terms that Henry Kissinger has laid out. So the two sides were able to negotiate a truce.
Yeah, Kissinger was a Machiavellian type of guy, but in the end, Egypt and Israel, it's not sustainable to fight forever.
Yeah, and so they both realized that we can't keep fighting. Sadat was able to conclusively prove to his people, most of them, that he was willing to fight Israel, but there was just no percentage in it. So eventually they signed a peace treaty. It was brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, in which the Israelis and the Egyptians agreed to live in peace. And that is one of the few peace treaties that in that area that is held up now for over 40 years.
So how would you rank Golda? You know, looking back on this long career, this legacy that she gave so much of her life for?
Well, I give Golda high marks for determination, high marks for being very clear-headed and ruthless when she needed to. And she was always very realistic. She would say things like, well, like the comment you made earlier about how we'd rather be alive with a bad reputation than the other way around. So she was very, very clear-headed, very determined, and she was a next-level 3D chess master at international diplomacy. So I give her super high marks for that. She also understood warfare at a high level. She knew that modern wars are fought with weapons, but they're also won by triangulating the superpowers and the local battlefield and the UN and the long-term interests of the countries. And she could play this game like few others could. So she gets high marks for that. She was surprised by the invasion. She kind of let her generals and her intelligence guys tell her there would be no invasion. And, you know, she never fully lost her nerve, but she always felt like I let the Egyptians and Syrians get the jump on us, and that cost the lives of thousands of Israelis. So
It did.
You know, I think I'd give her probably an 8.5.
Yeah.
Maybe her only real flaw was she was so hardline against the Arabs before the Yom Kippur War that they kind of felt they had no choice but to invade her. So
Yeah.
I'd give her an 8.5.
I mean, I think it is so incredible that anyone at that age is functioning at that level and taking on new chapters in their life. I mean, I look up so much to my grandmother, who is in her 80s, and she takes up new hobbies all the time, like the harp and different crafting, and she's so active.
Yeah, she still goes tent camping at parks in North Carolina, did a biking trip. And, she's one of my heroes. She's my mom.
Yeah.
But I think she, Golda, and other women's examples show that you're never really too old to start a new chapter in your life or take on a big responsibility. So I give her props for that, too.
Yeah, for sure.
At the beginning of our show, Emily and I talked about courage. Golda Meir showed a lion's courage during the Yom Kippur War. Even when she was afraid her country would be overwhelmed, she didn't give up, and she didn't give in to the temptation to use atomic weapons. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of War Queens. That's our show for today. Listen to every episode of War Queens for more stories of women who brought their nations through the fires of war. If you have any questions for us about War Queens, if you're curious about something you heard on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at warqueens@diversionaudio.com. Again, that's warqueens@diversionaudio.com. We'll try to answer your questions on a future episode. Find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at War Queens Podcast. War Queens is a production of Diversion Audio. Your hosts are John Jordan, Emily Jordan, and I'm Natalie Emmanuel. The show is written by John and Emily Jordan based on their book, The War Queens. Our supervising producer and sound designer is Mark Francis, with production assistance from Antonio Enriquez, editorial direction from Jacob Bronstein and Scott Waxman. Our head of marketing is Erica Farmer. Our theme music is by Tyler Cash. Executive producers, Jacob Bronstein, Mark Francis, and Scott Waxman for Diversion Audio.